And so we're all three of us are a huge fan of one key in-season fantasy tool, and that is the rolling average graph. I've loved these for a number of years. Scott, I know you do, and it was wonderful to hear that Nate, you love them as well. Let's kick it over to Nate. For you first, what are some of the rolling average graphs tools that you use? And then how do you use each type of rolling graph during the season for your fantasy analysis?
Yeah, so I use two separate sources for my rolling graphs. I use fan graphs, player graphs on the player pages, and then I'll also use Pitcher List's own rolling graphs, mostly the process plus ones, and then some of the like our decision value and swing aggression. I was trying to think of words to explain it, and I think Scott said it best earlier this morning. It's very rare to see a 300 hitter actually hit 300 at any point in the season. But rather it's a reflection of all these highs and lows that gets them there. And I think the rolling chart is the best way to fully see that, whether it's trying to understand why someone's struggling, why someone's doing great, and how they end up to where they are. On the Fangraphs rolling charts, my go-tos are things like fly ball rate, chase rate, or just swing percentage in general. I think it's a great way to see kind of overlaid with their like baseline WOBA. It's very easy to see, did they start hitting fly balls and directly started succeeding, or, did an increase in whiffs show why they're struggling? I think it's the easiest way to kind of identify what's, what is changing in a player's profile day to day in like a, 15 game span that can really explain what we're going to see going forward.
Definitely. I hear you on the variance piece. I always think it's really interesting just to look at different periods of time on the rolling charts and just how much more variance there is with the smaller sample size, which just gives you a sense of, like you mentioned, like there's those highs, there's those lows, and over the course of the season, hopefully that player gets to what the skills reflect. How about you, Scott? What are your go-tos for hitters for rolling average charts? And I know I've seen quite a few rolling average chart presentations from you, so I'm excited to hear your input.
Yeah, and frankly, I think the best place to start is actually the simplest one. I love just starting with rolling strikeout and walk rates. So one of the best ways to use rolling charts isn't just to like try to catch a trend, right? Because the problem is that rolling charts aren't predictive. They're extremely descriptive. They tell us what has already happened in a very important way. One of the best things they do is bake sample size right into the thing you're seeing, right? So like a lot of folks during the season, they're trying to figure out who to add. What's the first thing they do? Your league mates are doing this. They jump straight to the free agent and just say, who's been the best over the last 15 days, which is an extreme, like, it's useful because our brains need a smaller pool of players than all eligible MLB players on your wire. However, the problem is that 15 days is an incredibly arbitrary point for most stats, right? Very few things are anything close to reliable, which is, by the way, I don't always like the term stabilized because it makes it seem like it's stabilized. That means it's going to stay like this. That is not at all what it means. It really means reliable. This number means something. That's really what it's telling us. And the rolling chart, you can bake that right in so that when you're seeing these, let's say you're doing it, Fangraphs likes to go by games, right? So it'll do it on a games basis, and you got 15 games. You're looking at close to 50 plate appearances there. That's actually a pretty reliable point for strikeouts. So when you create a rolling graph on Fangraphs of 15 game rolling strikeout rate, every single point on that graph, except for like the first couple, because the way Fangraphs does it, it starts at like, it'll often have a very high or very low end point because that's just what it was for like day one when there was not really sample size. But every point past that is a useful piece of data. So every point on the graph is useful. Whereas when we're looking at just like last 15 days, that's not useful for most stats. But walk rates, strikeout rates, we get meaningful data from them very, very quickly. So that's a good one. The other thing I like to do is, we're playing one of the reasons I love them, and one of the things I like to do is we're playing our season. We're like, man, this slump stinks, right? What's wrong? This is the Aaron Judge storyline to start last year. Many people forget about it because he was so good, but like everyone's like, man, what's wrong with him? Is he hurt or whatever? if you looked at the rolling charts, it was a normal slump. It's a thing that's happened to him before that he got out of very quickly and went right back to being Aaron Judge, right? And that's exactly what happened. It's, if you look at his rolling averages for like WOBA, power, anything, you're like, oh yeah, that dip doesn't look special. And that's one of the things that's really hard to get out of in-season, like regular stats. Like, oh, over the last 30 days has been terrible. Yeah, but is he more terrible than usual? Right? Like, we might say it's his worst June, right? But the beginning and end of June is an arbitrary endpoint. Who cares? Right? Like, that, it's a sample size, so it's useful. And June is an easier thing to say than between, you know, X day and X day. But the rolling charts can help us really conceptualize, hey, is this slump worse than what we've seen from him in the past? Does this slump mean anything? Or is it just a regular old slump that every other player has, right? Is this normal, right? Kyle Schwarber, crazy ups and downs. Having a slump of 2 weeks is not important. Like, it's not really important to us with Kyle Schwarber unless it's significantly worse than anything we've seen before, right? Or, you know, hey, this player's hot. Anyone can be hot for 50 plate appearances, right? Like, any player. Like, Rhys Hines went crazy for like 2 weeks, right? Like, anyone good enough to make the majors can do that. The question is, like, is this meaningful, especially if we have a long track record and out of nowhere we see this big power spike and then it just kind of goes away. The question then becomes, did that mean it? Like, this is new power, but so what, right? Or it's just a regular little power spike for a guy or a regular slump. That kind of context is so important in season, and the rolling chart's really the only way to get it.
Yeah, the Rhys Hines point is well taken, because I remember last year when he came up and he was just crushing, he went for like hundreds of dollars in fab, right? And now we're in DC season where we're doing these 50 player draft and holds, and Rhys Hines is barely even drafted, you know? So like the fact that he hit that peak when he first came up and now he's an afterthought, even in the deepest of drafts, is really interesting. I like what you mentioned too about like the denominator, like looking at Ks. Ks obviously plate appearances is the denominator there. That's what I love. I know we're in hitters right now, but like I love being able to get more granular and looking at like pitch level data on pitchers, because the denominator, you have a larger sample size. So definitely there. I'm wondering, do either of you have a rolling average graph up that you might be willing to share with us? I was going to share one, but because of my tech issues, I don't want to mess around with trying to share my screen. Do either of you have one available you could share? Just to kind of walk us through like how exactly you use it.
Yeah, I will pull up. We can do the one I was looking at earlier was Julio Rodriguez, because I just am fascinated by his 2024. So I'm going to give this a shot. Can you guys see that all right?
I can't see it yet.
No.
Can you see it, Scott?
No, not yet. So if you need to, I can pull them up. I presented about a dozen of them earlier today.
Let's just do that then.
Yeah. Do I have a rolling chart? Get out of here. Do I have one? How many do you need? That's the real question. So let me present over here. Share screen. Share screen.
Yeah.
This entire screen.
Do you have 25 rolling charts available right now that you can access?
Obviously, I do. I told it to share my screen. But I'm not sure anyone can see it.
I think that's what happened to me. Good thing the tools we use are for fantasy baseball, not necessarily for attack.
Yeah. Well,
there you go. There you go. I mean, just visualize the rolling average.
I'll figure it out. Yeah. We'll get there. I'll figure it out while we're talking, and we'll show folks, and we can even show them how to generate one. Just at the end, because we're not done talking about them.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, we talked a little bit about the Fangraphs ones, the Process Plus, and others that y'all are using. One other tool I know that all of us use is the Fangraphs leaderboards. And so I'm curious, Nate, let's go to you again. We'll prioritize the Liverpool fan here. What metrics do you typically include in your leaderboard? That's question number one. And I'm curious if you've created custom leaderboards as well. I know that's a tool that I use a lot.
Yeah, so I love the custom leaderboard features. All of the boards are great, but my main boards, I'm not even going to attempt to share my screen here, but I have all of my normal, fantasy stats, but then also, walk rate, strikeout rate, chase rate, Z contact, and then all of my contact peripherals, xWOBA, barrel rate, pull rate, fly ball rate, etc. I then love to, I'll use that to look and sort top to bottom, who's making a lot of great contact over the last 2 weeks. Are they doing anything with the batted ball profile? Not necessarily looking at the kind of total performance, but seeing, are there skill changes? Are there, as Scott said, the peaks or the troughs of something in a rolling chart that we can identify as something as either a hot streak or a skill change. The other thing I like to do with them is I don't know if you can do this as a free member of Fangraphs, but I know as a premium member you can, but save the reports of players as well. So after I draft a team, I will like to load all of my players and save that kind of as a view. So I make sure I can monitor, if I forget that my fourth outfielder has just been on like a 2 or 3 week slump, he's still getting everyday plate appearance, but it's just tanking my batting average. It's something that's more likely to come across my view rather than just trying to go into a leaderboard of everything and hope that I see, a player that I care about's name at any specific moment.
I'm curious, like when you use the custom leaderboard, are you typically accessing that through your leaderboards, or do you have like under each like player profile, have you set the default to different metrics within like each player profile?
So I have like my kind of standard one that hits on a little bit of everything. And then I will pull that, I will recreate that with all of my teams, I also will have like a rolling watch list of players. So, the random, utility infielder who might get enough plate appearances over a month period, or, a star that I'm eyeing to trade on another team. Just making sure that I kind of have all of my bases covered, because I'm already deep diving on all of these players anyway. If something catches my eye on just kind of the top level peripheral stats, it'll maybe cause me to, do a deep dive, spend an extra 5 or 10 minutes on a player that I don't have rostered, because I saw him in the right spot on the leaderboard.
Yeah, great. That's awesome. How about you, Scott? Are you using the Fangraphs leaderboards as well, or what are some other tools that you use?
Yeah, I like the leaderboards on both Fangraphs and on Baseball Savant. Savant can give you some StatCast leaderboards that we also have some cool ones over at Pitcher List. I'll tout our stuff plenty as we go. I'll talk about some other stuff here for a second, but I like both. I like the leaderboards over on StatCast. Some cool stuff. Like they actually have a rolling charts delta leaderboard, like who has seen their rolling averages go up or down the most over the last like 50, 100, and 250 plate appearances. So that one's really cool to kind of take a look at. I also, like the leaderboard on Fangraphs, especially if you can customize it a little bit, pick some extra stats. I love I don't necessarily love it because sometimes it's bad news, but I really like to be able to see like who's getting lucky right now, right? And BABIP and expected batting averages, those are one way to get it. The other way is to just look at stuff that players can't usually do over a long period of time. Like, so what I'll do is, maybe I'll make a custom leaderboard and I'll make sure I add zone contact, because players with a zone contact rate roughly under about 80% most of them are going to struggle to make any kind of consistent contact over, a period of time. It's really hard to succeed if you're not, making contact with 4 out of 5 things you swing at in the zone. And I also like to look at line drive rate. What's nice about those leaderboards is that you can also just turn anything into a plus stat, right? Put it on that like league average scale, give you a nice number that's easy to conceptualize. If you're wondering what the plus, the plus measurement is, basically makes 100 average, and every point up or down is about a standard, it's about 1% better or worse than league average, right? So if you've got a 125, let's say line drive plus, that means you're hitting line drives about 25% more than the average player. So we know that line drives are the flukiest form of contact. They almost always lead to fantastic results, but it's really, really difficult to sustain high line drive rates for a long period of time. There are players that do it, right? Luis Arias being a good example, Freddie Freeman. These guys will hit line drives a lot, and they've shown us over longer periods of time that that's what they're going to do. But other players will just like kind of pop up out of nowhere and be like, man, this guy's average is great. And it turns out he's hitting like 35% line drives for a month, which is great. Dude's locked in, and there's no way that's continuing, right? So being able to look at that leaderboard and say like, whoa, like, yeah, like the expected average is good because he's hitting a bunch of line drives. We know they're supposed to be hits, but you can take that next level and say, oh, whoa, yeah, but he's not going to keep hitting line drives like this. And then you can start thinking about, so what will those line drives turn into, right? Historically, what's he done more of? Will they start turning more into ground balls, fly balls, even split? What's it going to be? Start thinking about the impact. But yeah, the leaderboards can help you kind of conceptualize that. And it also, again, it's a great way. Our brains cannot process there's 129 qualified hitters last year, right? We cannot just be thinking about all of them all the time, right? And if you can, you don't need to watch this anymore. You're done. You're fine.
I was going to say, speak for yourself, Scott.
Yeah. Our brains need smaller groups, right? Leaderboards help you create a meaningful, smaller group that you can sort of start your research on. Also, because you probably have something else to do that day. And doing a deep dive on 129 players is going to take some time, right? And if you have a smaller sample size, it's even more, right? That's qualified for the whole season. But qualified for a month, there's even more. So it's a great way to just start. Just a fantastic starting point, right? We talked about rolling charts, which are a great next level, right? First you pick a player, then you get a chart. If you're still at the stage of, I want to know who to dive in on, the leaderboard is a fantastic starting point.
Absolutely. Yeah. What you mentioned about kind of the extremes or the unsustainable performance measures, I think are something that I definitely go to a lot. I don't play in trading leagues, but I'm curious if you guys play in trading leagues, do you use that data to identify players that you either want to add? Like maybe somebody has an unsustainably high BABIP and you know that they're going to come crashing down. Do you look to trade or take advantage of it in that way? Or are you mostly utilizing it for free agent pickups or guys on your roster who you're thinking about dropping? Just open for both of you.
I think it's mostly kind of waiver pickups, monitoring my own guys. Like I'll have a watch list of a guy I might want to trade for, but like there's a good chance if I'm talking trade with someone, they're looking at the same data I am. And I don't think, a hot or a cold streak at that point. Like I've already made up my mind, am I going to trade for a player? Am I not interested in a player? So it's really only monitoring kind of specific success and knowing, what is, why is my player quiet? It's a low BABIP month or whatever.
There was a time when BABIP was like a secret weapon you pulled out, right? And you'd say, oh yeah, dude, don't you see this guy's hitting 380 over the last 6 weeks, right? Oh, you got to get him, right? I can't believe I'm even willing to trade him. There was a time, right? That time is gone. We all have access to an immense amount of data. Even if you don't pay for any special form of data, you have access to a ton of it, right? I like to think my league mates know what BABIP is, right? I'm pretty sure they do. They talk like they do. And I'm not going to fool them that way, right? Now, there are some things that I think I can do that might give me an advantage, or at least my brain thinks it will, right? By thinking about things like, okay, I know that low zone contact rate plus high line drive rate means I'm not interested, right? And that's actually probably how I use the leaderboard a lot of times. It's to vet a guy, right? It's like, okay, I'm seeing the stats, oh yeah, you are killing it on the leaderboard. Now I can do a deeper dive on you and see what else is going on. Or, I noticed like, wow, my team really stinks lately. Look, a bunch of them are at the bottom of the leaderboard in BABIP right now. Okay. Yeah, sure. That sounds right. Or those kinds of things. But again, I agree with Nate. It's mostly about there's a big pool of players I'm after, or potentially could be after on the wire. Leaderboards will help me figure out which of them are the most worth my time in investigating and possibly picking up.
Yeah, don't you just long for those times when like not everybody tracked a BABIP, or not everybody knew that like some guy had, a really high ERA, but the peripherals didn't support that, and they went way back in drafts instead of like where they should go. I long for that time. Fantasy baseball was a lot easier with less data, right?
I know we're talking about hitters, but Ronaldo Lopez is, absolute, erasure on ADP boards. It's just like people know too much these days. Again, like the most undeserved, untalked about 1.99 ERA season I think anyone's ever seen. It's ridiculous.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we will get to pitchers in 1 second. It's a great transition point. But before we get there, sometimes there are like what I think of as the less glorious in-season tools. And so, Scott, I know that you use lineup trackers on Roster Resource through Fangraphs and maybe some other locations. Can you talk a little bit about how you use those lineup trackers and how are they valuable in season for you?
Yeah, there's a couple things about them that are really helpful. One, if you're doing daily fantasy, that's when it's like the most obviously helpful, right? Like, hey, I know in a lot of daily leagues that I've played in, I've kept an open roster spot just for like a flavor of the day, flavor of the week kind of thing. Looking at the daily lineups, it's like, oh, hey, this dude's leading off out of nowhere against a soft pitcher. Let's do it, right? Let's toss him in. Let's see if I get a couple free hits. But also, it's really good for just tracking players in general, right? Like when I'm a big part of Michael Harris second, his stats, especially early on, were really tied to where in the lineup is he hitting, right? And it became, when I was noticing he was playing second, by seeing when he's playing second more or hitting second, I'm like, oh snap, like that, I can start seeing the difference there. Or just seeing players move up and down in their batting orders, right? Seeing how often, oh, wow. It's hard to just remember when a guy sat, but if you can look at lineup trackers like Roster Resource, you can look at like the last 30 lineups and be like, oh, wow, this dude is sat against every lefty, right? I didn't realize that, but because maybe they've only played 5 in the last 3 weeks, right? Or, one way I'll use it is, wow, this guy's really hot. What's going on here? Oh, he's just one of those classic righty who mashes lefties. And out of nowhere, this team has seen like 8 lefties in 10 games. Right? That's why he's hot. It's not because anything's changed. He's just getting the perfect matchups for himself. Or, man, so-and-so sitting a lot. Is he hurt? Nope. They've just faced, he's just mostly against righties and they face a ton of lefties. So he hasn't found a way to get in the lineup. And it sounds obvious when you say it, but sometimes like in the heat of everything, you're in the middle of a season, you're tracking lots of players at once. All of a sudden, some guys are always in a platoon and some of them are in platoons only for a week or two. Right? And just getting a jump on understanding that it's happening, why it's happening, who's getting the at-bats instead of them, keeping track of all that. Lineup trackers can really help you do that. And it can help you, again, just conceptualize what's going on right now.
Yeah, definitely. Nate, how about you? Do you use lineup trackers in a similar way? Do you have a favorite lineup tracker that you use, if so?
Yeah, I also use Roster Resources. I think I might have Roster Resource open every single second within the season. As Scott said, it's, a very valuable tool, monitoring platoons, like trying to see, is the lefty getting at bats against a lefty? I think it's really interesting when a guy is slumping, do you actually see a drop to the lineup, or on the vice versa? Do you see the jump? Guy hitting 6 does great, and he needs to get the bump to second. So it's a great way to kind of track, the changes that we see that are reflected by performance.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that for me, like I do NFBC leagues, and so I'm always sorting through plate appearance, but every single guy that I might be interested in, I'm always looking at Roster Resource to see over those last 6 games, why are those plate appearances so high? Because like sometimes you have guys who, they're only playing against lefties, but they faced 5 lefties, like Scott mentioned. And so they're showing up as playing a lot, but it's just because of those platoon splits or because they're being platooned. So really good. And I feel like I call it unglorious because it always feels like when I think about the grind, a lot of it is like every single player that I'm adding to a fab list, I'm looking at like their playing time over the last little bit to try to figure out if there's something. Or maybe there's a guy who's really high skilled and he's played the last 2 games and it's different usage than they've been using before. And I want to be able to kind of react quickly to that. So
with Fab, it's, you're not often taking guys who are hitting first, second, and third in any given lineup. So you really need to see where they're hitting. Are they getting your extra, 4, 5, 6 plate appearances a week that make your dollars actually worth it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And those plate appearances are absolutely huge. So this panel, I mean, we are humming because it is 2:30 and we are making the pivot from hitters over to pitchers and how we use them. So what are some of the in-season tools that you are using to track and evaluate pitchers, Nate?
So, I mean, I may be biased here as a pitcher list staffer, but the pitcher list house of tools is just absolutely exceptional, and it's part of why I'm now writing here. Starting with Nick's starting pitcher roundup, I'm reading those every day because not only am I reading about the pitchers that I'm following, I'm watching in any given night, but also learning about the entire league environment. Is someone doing something differently? Hearing, what changed from the start 5 days ago to the start today. Something I might not catch because there are just so many pitchers and so many pitches being thrown, and I'm not nearly as crazy enough to follow that as closely. But then we have within our game logs all of the data that you could really want. We have, CSW percentage, location, induced vertical break, vertical approach angle, velocity, pitch usage. So it's a really easy way to check night in and night out. How did your pitcher perform? Did they do something differently? Did stuff change? Did usage change? That makes it really easy to evaluate just with how much is going on on the pitching side of things.
Yeah, totally. I remember when Nick created that CSW stat, that was like maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And it's been awesome to see how how that stat has trickled into other places too, like being able to see it on Fangraphs now and stuff like that. So that's awesome. And please promote the pitcher list. There's amazing resources at pitcher list. So do not feel bad about doing that. Scott, you are a flexible human who is taking care of kiddos at the same time that you're doing the panel, and you're still crushing it. So what are some of the tools that you like to use when you're evaluating pitchers?
Yeah, actually, I really have one, right? Like Nick kind of keeps me on the hitters, and I use Nick's stuff for the pitchers. And I'm glad Nate mentioned the game logs and all the stats are there. What's also there are Nick's SP roundup write-ups for each of those players and each of those starts. So again, I don't get the chance to watch every pitcher every start. And game logs, even good ones, can only tell me so much, right? They don't always, like, you really have to dig in to try to see like game flow and all that. But Nick gives you that. That SP roundup will tell you like, hey, you know what? He got Babbitt to death out there, right? Like, yeah, they hit his cutter, but they shouldn't have. Right? You watch those pitches, they're great pitches. Guys just, got some good wood on it and it happens. Or, it'll tell you like, hey, you know what? Early in this game, he didn't have the feel for that slider, but it came back. Right? Like that kind of stuff, like that narrative is so important when you're trying to understand like, hey, this guy, or, hey, this guy's on a 4-game run. I'll read Nick's roundup for each of those 4 starts, right? Sometimes you get to watch Nick sort of convert and like this guy now, right? The first time it's skeptical. And by the end, it's like, no, this works, right? Like he's gone to the Blake Snell blueprint or something like that. And it's great. And other times you get to see Nick just stay skeptical, right? And continue to give you additional reasons why maybe he's not buying it, right? Like maybe it's that Martin Perez thing where he just had amazing location, pinpoint accuracy that was unlikely to stick around forever. He's always going to have some of it, but he's never, this is that dream miracle run for him that's going to be better than anything he's really done before. And being able to just see that in those roundups and that narrative, that's what's really important to me. Because again, I can find dudes with high strikeout rates, right? Like I can, we can, there's plenty of people that have been compiling lists of like, oh, hey, who added a slider in spring training, right? Like those kinds of things. Like that's cool. But that narrative that you get pitch by pitch, it's not a stat, but man, it's an important tool. Reading the SP roundup every day is awesome. But when you're doing that specific player analysis, instead of having to go find those different SP roundups for each of those starts, go to the guy's game log on pitcher list. You get Nick's write-up for all of them, right? I think sometimes the weekend ones don't always get pulled in, but pretty much every start will be in there, and you can just follow along, see what's going on, see how this guy's growing, and get a start-by-start narrative as you go.
And I think one of the biggest things that has most utility is when you see that, pitcher got pulled with, 1 out in the 7th, 2 runners came in to score. So that line doesn't even reflect fully how someone pitched that night. And yeah, as Scott said, it's just the great way to learn kind of what happened in the game that you completely missed and what the true performance was.
Yeah, you guys, you have me thinking. I mean, I don't know if PitcherList has this already. You guys might, but there needs to be like some AI chat bot that's like Nick's face, and you like type in like a player, and then it like gives you Nick's like little like summary, of what he has to say about the pitcher. I would love to see you guys make that happen at PitcherList. So maybe you can communicate that over to Nick.
Some Nick GPT,
Yeah, Nick GPT. That would be pretty awesome. I know the next piece that is my favorite, I think, tool, just because I get some sort of like weird joy out of looking at rolling average graphs for pitchers. Like there's something that to me is particularly beautiful about those rolling average charts. I'm curious, like you guys have mentioned a little bit, but like when you're looking at that rolling average chart for a pitcher, what are the key metrics that you're looking for there?
I'm pretty straightforward. I will almost exclusively use rolling charts for pitchers for strikeouts and walks. I think it's just the easiest way. I mean, K-BB is one of, if not the most predictive tool on the pitching side. So it's a really just quick way to see, are the strikeouts rising? Are the walks going down? What's causing that? And that's usually the big tip off of, was there a pitch mix change? Did the velo go up or down? That I really like to see, because when I'm more of a pitcher guy, so I will end up spending more time doing deep dives on the pitcher player pool, and will just use the strikeouts and walk rolling graphs to identify is something kind of out of the norm.
How about you, Scott?
That's really the key, Nate. It's like, hey, is this like the Nick's write-ups give us some of that, but also like, what's this, is what this guy doing something unique or different? If you're in the chat, you'll notice that I linked to Tarek Skubal's 15-game rolling strikeout rate. And what's really cool about it is you see towards the end of last year and then coming into 2024, it's not just that he was striking out more guys, he was striking out significantly more guys, right? And then he stayed up there. His worst rolling strikeout rate in 2024 was pretty much in line with the best 15-game rolling strikeout rate that he had in 2021 or 2022, right? Like that's telling me not a fluke. Something is obviously it wasn't a fluke. He won a Cy Young and he's the greatest ever, but he's that sign. Like when he started dipping down, I wanted to see how far, especially now, like I want to see how far that's going to go. To see it stop, it's like, once players, once he realized I'm not striking out 30% of these hitters, something's got to change. And it does, right? Like he stopped, like the buck stops there. He starts moving it back the other direction. That's so huge in analyzing a player like Tarek Skubal, who we all liked, right? We all thought there was upside, but then he did something so much better than we expected. And we're like, is this legit? Is this something, a rolling chart won't necessarily tell you that it's sustainable going forward, but he certainly sustained it last year at a level that's better than he's ever done it before. Yeah, sure, the regular stats tell you that, but that rolling chart, it's so unique because it's showing you like, it was better, and it was better the whole time. It wasn't front loaded. It wasn't back loaded. It was better the whole time.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I hope Skubal keeps it up this year because I just drafted him in a really important draft of mine. So let's hope he does well, and the Tigers do as well. I should have worn my Tigers hat, knowing you were here, Scott. I'm going to try to share my screen here. I don't know if it's going to work or not, because I do think it would be helpful to see. It would be helpful to see one of these rolling average graphs that we can see. So let me see. Let me know if this shows up, guys. I'm hoping it does. Can you see it?
No, I think because we've got three different screens on, it's not going to let us.
It's not going to let us. Okay, cool. Well, I'll stop sharing then. This is really like, it's heartbreaking to me because seeing these rolling average graphs, I was going to share with you Daniel Lynch's, the fourths, not the thirds or the seconds, the fourths, rolling average chart, which is my favorite one that I've seen all off season, when he goes from just like middling pitcher on a lot of different metrics to just like absolutely elite across the board, because it's just, the curves on it are just, they're great. So anyways, all right, we talked a lot about starting pitchers, focusing on starting pitchers, but there's also some resources that are super useful for bullpen reports. We've all been in leagues where we need saves or there's high demand for saves. Some pitcher gets injured or struggles in their performance, and everybody is speculating on who's going to get the bulk of saves, who's next in line. And this can really be like, this is where leagues are won and lost, right? Like I remember Liam Hendricks when he was on the A's, I think it was Trinan, and he had that really bad year. And then Hendricks came on, and the second half of that year was just unbelievable, like the best pitcher in baseball. If you got him, you did really well. If you went for whoever the other guy was that we don't even remember who it was, then you didn't. So what are some of the tools that you use for bullpen usage? And I'll ask you first, Scott.
Yeah, again, Pitcher List has one. I know other sites do as well, but bullpen usage, right? So Pitcher List uses an article that comes out every day. We call it Reliever Ranks. I know Fangraphs in the roster resource section has a bullpen tracker. I believe Rotographs also does a daily roundup on relief pitchers. I'm not going to say you have to pick one or the other, but use them, right? Because again, your league mates can all pull up a graph on saves, right? They can all pull up a leaderboard on holds, right? What they can't get is that narrative of how has this been going? When is the manager looking to this guy, right? The classic example is, the fireman who you'd think would be getting saves because he's best arm of the bullpen. Turns out he came on in the 8th because that's where the heart of the lineup was going, right? That's why. It's hard to see that when you go back. You have to really dig through the game log to do that. But these roundups will give you that game by game as you go, right? Or they'll say like, they pulled this guy and here's why, right? Like, it was as bad as it looked, right? He came out through 4 pitches. They were all terrible. He stayed for the minimum and they pulled him out of there, or those kinds of things. And also it's a great way, especially like in a points league or anywhere you're trying to like snipe a win or maybe a save, those usage charts, like, yeah, sure. Josh Hader's the closer. He's always the closer. Unless he's been used 2 or 3 days in a row, right? Then he's not the closer that day. And how do you know that? You can know that going right in. These charts, these articles, they're going to tell you that, like, hey, this dude's not going to be available today. He threw, 35 pitches yesterday and, 20 the day before. He's out for a day or two, right? He's, not hurt or anything. It's just, they don't make relievers throw 90 pitches over 3 days, right? Terrible for them. Or you can see like, oh, wow, this whole bullpen got wrecked yesterday, right? So they're calling up a guy from AAA, but really he's just here because all the arms are spent. They played maybe it didn't seem like it was a long game because it was only 9 innings, but it was a long game because innings just lasted forever, right? Like that kind of context is really important when you're trying to make, especially day by day decisions, right? Like it's crazy in a daily league to bench Josh Hader, unless he's not going to go that day, right? And you can go stream a guy, right? Or go do what it is you're going to do. What could have been a hard decision of like, oh man, this closer, that closer, could be a very easy one because one of them ain't going that day, right? No chance. So that's a really critical tool to use, especially when you're just making those regular lineup decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a couple things from what you mentioned, like the qualitative piece of it. So understanding the context of them, because I know like with roster resource or a lot of them, it's like they pitched on this day and this is how many pitches they pitched and whether they got a hold or a save, but really understanding that context of why was it? Or maybe like somebody didn't get a save who usually does, but it's because there was 3 lefties. And so they went to their lefty, high leverage guy, so I think that qualitative piece is really important. And in deeper leagues too, I think beyond just the guys who have saves, I really like what you said about the daily, where it's like, if Hader's thrown the last 2 days, you can maybe get some Ks and some help with your ratios if you go to some high leverage middle reliever. I think in a lot of the 15 team leagues that I play in, sometimes there just aren't starting pitchers that I want in that week. And so I'll look for middle relievers, and the usage charts are super helpful because I look for guys that are good relievers, but who also have 7 games that week and didn't pitch on Sunday, and that way, maybe you get 4 appearances that week, probably 3, but less likely that you're going to get 2. So you're not losing as much when it comes to Ks and things like that. Nate, how about you? How do you use bullpen reports, or are there anything beyond bullpen reports or just skill related things that you look at when you're targeting relievers or figuring out how to handle the reliever market?
Yeah, I mean, you guys hit on just about all you can hit on when it comes to the reliever reports. Like, talk about the grind of the fantasy baseball season. That's, I think, where it really lies. As to your last point, one of my favorite things to do in daily leagues is to kind of identify the high stuff 7th inning guys, because a lot of times those are the ones who are getting the save or win opportunity when the team blows a 6-run lead and it's a getaway day. They told their 2 top guys that they're not going, who's filling in, and they're being used for 60, 70 innings. They've bounced around a few places. I can think of like Andrew Kittredge on the Cardinals last year, like 36-year-old 1-year deal. They were going to use him till his arm falls off. And sure enough, he shows up in every single situation, more or less. I think he logged like 50, 60 innings in a role that he was probably the 4th or 5th most talented guy, but he had the role. And they were going to use him. And I got a handful of wins and I think a couple of saves as well. But it's really just, it's going through the reports. It's, understanding, again, everyone's looking at the same data there. It's just, are you actually using it to your advantage, especially if you have, RP only slots in your league?
Well, and nothing's as valuable as watching the game, right? But like, I am pretty sure none of us have the time to watch every single game every single day, right? Or even, you know what? I don't have time to watch 25% of major league action in a single day. I just don't. Like, I'm sorry. Like, I would love that, but I don't. But that doesn't mean nobody did it, right? That's what these charts are for, right? Like, hey, look, you couldn't be there. Here's the next best thing, right? In that context, like, again, we talked earlier. We've all got stats now. Your league mates all have stats. Yahoo, ESPN, they all post stats for you, right? Like, you can sort by them, whatever. They've got their own leaderboards. What they don't get out of just those leaderboards is context. They don't give you narrative. The reason we don't all draft the same teams is because we all create different narratives based on this. Like, yeah, the stats we get are mostly the same. Some of us get some cool special ones that Kyle Bland made up and some of us don't. But like, at the end of the day, we mostly have this, like, a very similar set of stats to work with. How we put them together and create a story out of that we then act on, that's what's different, right? That's what sets us apart. And luck, like, obviously luck plays a big role in this. Like, no matter how good you are, you will lose sometimes because the dude you thought was going to rake that day hit 4 screamers and they all went straight to outfield gloves, right? Like, that just happens sometimes. But we create those narratives. That's why we all draft different teams, even though we all have the ADP data. We all have the stats from last year. We all have the projections, right? They're different narratives, and you can't make up narratives just from box scores. You need the input of someone who watched it, right? Doesn't have to be you. It can be anybody who watched it that you reasonably trust. Or maybe you don't, but at least you get their opinion. That's just as good as stats from that day. Because again, I can see that a dude's walking 10% of the hitters he's facing, right? For the last 5 games. I can see that. But why? What is it? I can't go back and watch every inning that he threw, but there are people that did, and they can help me understand what's going on.
Yeah, I came up with another thing that you need to create at Pitcher List, which is a Kyle Bland GPT. So like an AI bot of Kyle Bland that creates new metrics that are designed to get at whatever it is you're looking for at that moment in time. So I think we've created 2 new AI bots for Pitcher List that will help people out a lot when it comes to pitching and other metrics. So we've covered a ton of in-season tools. Are there any that we haven't? Well, first I'm going to say, I'm not sure if I have access to the chat. So if people have any questions for Nate, Scott, or myself, please put those. And then if you guys are monitoring it, let me know, because it looks like I need to join YouTube in order to do that, and I don't have that up. So let me know if there are any questions in the chat. Put in the chat your favorite in-season fantasy baseball tools, so that we can highlight some of those. But are there any other tools, hitting, pitching, qualitative, quantitative, that you both use that you find really valuable that you would want to share with listeners?
I think the biggest thing where I saw my biggest improvements across all fantasy was to just know what I'm using. We've talked about it the entire 51 minutes here. There is so much data. Everyone can see the data, and there are great things that you can access, but you just have to know what you're looking for. Do you need 4 different bullpen reports on any given night? Probably not. Do you need every single, swinging strike rate, called strike rate, whatever on every pitcher from a night? Probably not. But if the things that you can look at for an hour here or there that might actually give you valuable insights, you just have to stick to it and grind to it, because you can get just completely lost in all of the data that's out there. And then you haven't made a waiver claim, or you missed something that was just duly obvious, but you went so over the top that it just got missed.
Scott,
yeah, and I think with all that data, I think it's important to be humble with yourself a little bit and just say, like, I know what ISO is. I don't necessarily know what's a good one, right? Like what's good versus really good versus amazing, right? I don't conceptually, yeah, if you tell me an ISO's 300, I'm like, holy crap, right? I understand the extremes, but I don't always understand like what would be considered an above average pull rate. Like, yeah, 50%, but that's like pretty darn high. What's the level between that and average, right? That's where the plus stats come in. Again, Fangraphs has these, lots of sites do have them. It's really important to just, get a sense of like, what is normal? What is average? Because sometimes it will surprise you, right? Like sometimes that range can be fairly wide, right? Like a line drive rate, of 20% is pretty normal, but being at 17%, that's pretty normal too, right? Being up at 23, yeah, that's normal fluctuation. But when you start seeing things that are like a plus stat of like 120, 125, you're like, okay, this is quite a bit different than normal, right? Like the vast majority of players fall somewhere between 110 and 90 in these, because they're bell curves, right? Pretty much every stat we use in baseball ends up on a bell curve. So most players are in the middle, and then, there's fewer players on the outsides. That's not distributed evenly. And when you understand that, these plus stats are just understanding where the biggest part of the bell curve is, where most of the players are, versus when am I starting to see an outlier? That is huge for just, again, context. Like okay, it's, he's got a whatever batting average, let me pull up. Kyle Schwarber had a 248 batting average. That is an average plus of 100. That's average. That was the average player last year. It's not average for fantasy. Fantasy's numbers are going to be a bit higher than that. But again, it's context, because my brain wants to say 248's bad. It's not. It's actually just like, it's pretty normal for a baseball player to hit 248, right?
Especially for Kyle Schwarber, right?
It's very weird for Kyle Schwarber. Right? Like, I don't want that to be lost here. I talked about Kyle Schwarber earlier today and how much I love him, because he made some very important changes to his decision-making in the zone, to just be more, he didn't never swing. He's a he has a patience problem. So he's too patient. He started swinging more. It's important. But yeah, like that stuff, again, conceptually can be hard. You pull rate, right? Like, yes, Isak Paredes has a very high pull rate. You look at the number, you go, oh, that's a big number, right? But when you start getting in the middle, that's when it's really important. If you have any question, like, yeah, it went up and down, but is 1% a lot? Is 2% a lot? Like 5% is not a, you'll see that kind of fluctuation in some stats and it's not really a big deal. And for other stats, you're like, whoa, 5% different. A 5% change in swinging strike rate is extremely alarming, right? Like versus a 5% change in line drive rates, like, yeah, he's a little hot right now. No big deal. Right? Like that kind of context is really important. And it's missed on the leaderboards. It's missed in the raw stat. So when you go to the plus stats or whatever tool, however you want to do it, look at the league distribution and say, oh, okay, there's lots of dudes bundled up around here, right? There's tons of dudes that have a 700 OPS, right? Like I know 800 is 100 points better, obviously, but like, and it's obvious that that's a big change, but how much is there going on in between there, right? Like where's the distribution? Again, knowing that stuff, it's not about a specific player, but it really helps you when you pull up a dude's box score or pull up his season stat line, his baseball card, whatever. You're like, oh, okay, there's, I'm understanding not just what this number is, but in context, what is that like compared to the rest of the league or for an average player?
Yeah, totally. Agree with you both. I think the key, understanding. There's so much data, like you both mentioned, like sorting through it and understanding what's useful and what's not and how to apply it, I think is super important. I think, Scott, you mentioned earlier the predictive nature of some of the tools that we're looking at, right? So is what you're looking at predictive or is it descriptive? So can you use it to kind of have a better sense of what's going to happen in the future, or are we really just describing things that happened in the past? And so especially like when we think about season to season, I know we're talking in season, but I think that's one thing that's really important, and looking at like halves of seasons too. And then whether it's
presentation on predictiveness, right?
Yes.
Like that's its own universe. I do want to just add real quick, no stat is truly predictive, right? But we can talk about league wide, right? Generally speaking, for example, batted ball direction is not super predictive, right? Unless you are someone on the extremes, right? Again, Isak Paredes is my favorite example. I'm so sad the Tigers let him go and didn't realize they could just teach him to pull the ball and hit it to the very shortest part of the field every single time it goes in the air, and to always hit the ball in the air, right? So like, yeah, he had originally looked like a big change, but when you actually went into it, you're like, oh wow, okay, like this dude is just different. Yeah, pull rate as far as league goes is not super predictive, but when a player shows a skill and keeps repeating, you're like, oh wow, okay, this is something special. This deserves my attention.